In 2 Samuel 7, we'll definitely finish. May touch 2 Samuel 8 today. Remember in 2 Samuel 7, the whole of the chapter, we're going to see Samuel as the judge. This is Samuel's big chapter of being the judge. I told you last time, I'll say it again. Just because the book of Judges has ended doesn't mean the period of the judges has ended. Samuel is the last judge. Samuel very much in time overlaps with the judgeship of Samson. When you read the book of Judges, you see Samson as the last judge whose eyes are gouged out, who pushes the pillars and the walls fall down and 3,000 Philistines die. The continuation of the problem with the Philistines is in Samuel's day. Samuel and Samson overlap each other in time. I talked to you about that when we first started the book of Judges, that many of the judges would overlap in time. And so it was a total of a 300-year period. We're still in that 300-year period with Samuel. Samuel will end it. Samuel will end the 300-year period. So in 1 Samuel chapter 7, we read about Samuel as the last judge of Israel. It is true, I should say, that Samuel will appoint his two sons to be judges. But the reason I say Samuel is the last judge is because Samuel takes it upon himself to name his sons Yoel and Abihud, the two judges that would follow him. God didn't do that. Samuel did it. Samuel raises up his sons. He names his sons judges. They are rejected by Israel as being judges. They're bad men. And so Samuel will be, according to the Scriptures, the last judge, truly selected, raised up by Yahweh himself, the last judge of Israel. In chapters 8 through 12, we're going to see King Saul. 1 Samuel is the big book about King Saul. If you want to know about King Saul's events, what he did, who he was, how he behaved, how he was risen to be king, how God felled him, I should say, from being king, 1 Samuel is your book. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8 to 1 Samuel chapter 12, we'll read about the kingship of Saul, the first king of Israel. Not a king that God chose, a king that Israel, in effect, chose for themselves. God allowed it. He gave them a man that they deserved. Let's say it like that. David is the king that God would have had risen up. But Israel jumped the gun, demanded a king, and God said, okay, you want a king early? Before me? You want to get the cart before the horse? You want to jump out in front of my plan? I'll give you a king. He'll be terrible. His name is Saul, King Saul. In chapters 13, then after that, in chapters 13 to 15 of 1 Samuel, we'll see that God takes the kingship away from Saul and gives it to a young harp player. What's his name? David. God will strip the kingship from Saul many years before Saul's crown goes away. Saul will continue to rule as king. All the while, David has already been chosen to be the next king, this young boy. And maybe 20 or 30 years go by as David, not in kingship, but as Saul is the king, when God has already chosen David. A strange period of time we'll read about. So the kingship will be taken from Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, this is a chapter of leadership change in Israel. They will go from God being the king and raising up a judge every now and then to them rejecting God as the king, Yahweh as king, saying, we don't want you to be king over us. We want to have a king like all the other nations. That's this book. That's 1 Samuel chapter 8. That's about to happen next week. So we see this massive, the most major leadership change Israel will ever undergo when they cast off the kingship of Yahweh and say, we want a mere human king. A king that will lead us in battle, a king that we can see on his horse. A disaster. And so in verse 1, quickly, it says, the men of Kiriath Yearim, remember we're talking about the Ark of the Covenant, having been brought into the land of Canaan, into Israel. It came to this city, Kiriath Yearim. It says, the men of Kiriath Yearim came, and they took the Ark of the Lord. They brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill. He has a son named Eleazar. It says they consecrated Eleazar, his son, to keep the ark of the Lord, to keep it, to guard it, to protect it. All the things that the ark would need, this was put in the hands of this young boy. Remember, neither of these are priests. It went from the priestly city of Bet Shemesh into this city of normal, common Jews, Kiryat Yearim. And these two men, the house of Abinadab, is where the ark would stay for some 20 years before the events that begin in verse 3. Verse 2 says, "From that day the ark remained at Kiryat Yearim. The time was long, for it was 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord." Remember the period of the judges. They're in right relationship with Lord. Then they turn to idolatry. The Lord brings a Gentile nation to put their thumb, to oppress Israel. Israel will finally cry out to the Lord, "Lord, please save us from this oppression. We'll turn back to you." They'll put away their idols for a time, all their false god worship. They'll turn back to worship Yahweh. He'll raise up a judge for them. They'll cast off the oppression, the military oppression of the Gentile nation, and they will be at peace with Israel again. That's exactly what we're about to see. That's where we are. Israel has already become idolatrous in Samuel's day. Samuel is trying to turn them back to God. He will turn them back to God. He will be raised as a military leader. There will be a fight. God will do most of the fighting here. And Samuel will lead Israel in freedom from the Philistines. Remember, same group that Samson fought against, the great Philistines. So, in verse 3, 20 years go by between verse 2 and verse 3. It says the ark was in this city, Kiryat Yearim, for 20 years, and then something occurred. So 20 years go by, and then Samuel spoke. God has raised him up to be the judge. God has raised him up to be the one that would lead Israel in a military battle against the oppressor, the Philistines. It says, "Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, and he says to Israel, his fellow countrymen, if you return to Yahweh," not Baal, not Asherah, not all your false gods, Dagon, not all the false god pantheon, "if you return to Yahweh and worship him." So what Samuel the leader is saying, if you return to Yahweh with all your heart, not a portion of it, but all of it. Only Yahweh worship. You have to cast off all the false gods and only recognize Yahweh as God. If you return to Yahweh with all your heart, remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, because they were pagans. They were idolaters, not pagans. They were Jewish idolaters, worshiping anything you could worship. Sun, moon, stars, false gods, animals, cows, steers, frogs, lice, you name it. They were fallen into the worship of it. Samuel says you've got to put all that garbage away. Return to worshiping only the one true God, Yahweh. If you direct your hearts to Yahweh and serve him alone. Remember, he's a jealous God. He doesn't like any gods before him. No false gods, no syncretism. One God worship, the one true God, Yahweh. That's what Samuel is pushing. If you do this, look what it says at the end of it, then he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. I want to show you that we are in the cycle of a judge here. And God, because of this idolatry, all this foreign God worship, God has them under the oppression of the Philistines. Samson was a part of this. Samuel is the greater part of this. So, they actually listened. You have to say things like this when Israel does it, because it's so few and far between that you get to say, as a teacher of the Scriptures, Israel did right on this day. And they did. They actually listened and they acted on Samuel's words. They returned. They directed their hearts to Yahweh. They served him alone, even if it's for a brief moment, and it was. They did it. Verse 4 says, so the sons of Israel, look what they did. They removed the Baals. Notice these are plurals. They removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served Yahweh alone. A bright, shining moment in Jewish history, verse 4. Too bad it doesn't last for very long, but this is a bright, shining moment. Baal and Baal and Ashtoreth, ETH, are two gods, one male, one female. False gods. They don't exist except for in the mind of these people, but they are individual gods, Baal and Ashtoreth. But notice here that it's Baals, plural, and Ashtaroth. When you add that OTH, you're talking about a plural in Hebrew. And so this, Baals and Ashtaroth, is the way Samuel is using, he's using this phrase to represent all their false god worship. Whatever false gods you're worshiping, put them all away. Baal and Ashtoreth were simply the two names that he called out, but he was calling them to wipe away all of the false god idolatry, all the false god worship. That's why he makes them plural. We don't talk much about these individuals. I just want to spend a minute and tell you a few facts. Baal and Ashtoreth. Who are these people? These false gods, I should say. A couple of thoughts here. Baal was the god of thunder and rain. He was the storm god. He was the storm god of the Philistines, the Canaanites. Baal was the god of thunder and rain, and because of that, he was the god of fertility on earth. Rain. You need rain for things to grow, right? He is a fertility god, but he's also the storm god. And as we'll see here, God, Yahweh, is about to cause a storm to show his superiority over this false god Baal. Ashtoreth is his female counterpart. Ashtoreth was both the goddess of love and war. I'll give you another few names that other people called Ashtoreth by. The Babylonians had a name for her. The Greeks had a name for her. The Romans had a name for her. I wonder if you don't say it out loud, but I wonder if you can think of what the goddess of love and war was to the Babylonians and to the Greeks and the Romans. All they did was change the names. They kept worshiping a false god of love and war. They kept worshiping a false god of thunder and rain like Thor later on. They just changed the names of these false gods as you go through human history. But Ashtoreth was the goddess of both love and war. And this was a pair. That's why you always see Baal and Asherah or Baal and Ashtoreth. She went by several names. Baal and Astarte in some translations. All the same goddess. They function together as fertility deities. Remember, he's the god of rain, thus fertility on earth. You've got to have rain for crops to grow. She's the goddess of love. And so together, when they got together, they functioned together as fertility deities, and their sexual union, yes, that's what they believed, that the sexual union between these two false gods brought about life and fruitfulness to earth and everything on the earth. This is a twisted theology, but that's what they believed. And that's why their worship services were so focused on sexual union, because that's what they believed the gods had to do. And so when they did it on earth, that's why you see all the male cult prostitutes and the female cult prostitutes in Jewish false worship. They got it all from the pagans. So this is how Baal and Ashtoreth would make the earth fertile through a sexual union. Ashtoreth is also known, a couple of other names, as Astarte. The Babylonians called her Ishtar. The Greeks named her Aphrodite. And the Romans called her Venus. Same false god. Same false goddess. Now, another, just because we're here and we're talking about false gods for a moment, I went one step further. It is from the name Ishtar that we get the word Easter, which is a pagan fertility ritual complete with bunnies and eggs. That word Easter, you may have it in a translation, but Easter is not a celebration of a pagan fertility ritual following this goddess Ishtar. That weekend is Resurrection Sunday. It's a celebration of the resurrection, the rebirth. Talk about fertility, where God the Father gives new life to this Jesus no longer a mortal, but now raised immortal. And that's what Easter, this is what Satan uses. You just have to know these things, as unpopular as they may be, they're truth. Satan clouds the importance of Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead with this ritual. A ritual that worships a false god named Ishtar, who's almost always existed in the mind of the pagans. Nothing new, thousands of years old. Why the bunnies? Why the eggs? It's all about fertility. It's all about fertility worship. It's a pagan fertility ritual. The bunnies and the eggs have nothing to do with the truth of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, yet every year you see the bunnies and the eggs in the stores. And Satan has hijacked the resurrection and calls it Easter. This is where he gets the name. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? Not in God's eyes and not in Satan's eyes. Plays the same things over and over. You say, oh, certainly 21st century man isn't still a pagan idolater. Is that true or false? Certainly 21st century man has grown, has gotten beyond this foolish pagan ritual of worshiping false gods. You got to know what you worship and where these things come from. Easter is a word that's derived from the false goddess Ishtar, which is spoken of all the way back here in 1 Samuel chapter 7, where Samuel says you've got to get rid of this false god worship. Move it out of your thinking. It's false. It's a lie from the pits of hell. And worship God alone. Worship Yahweh alone. And He will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. Focus on that fact as we go forward. The deliverance from the Philistines is what Samuel is offering. If you, Israel, want to be delivered from the Philistines, He will raise me up as a judge. Maybe He already had, I'm sure, in taking Samuel to the people with these words. But He will cast off the oppression of the Philistines. But first, you have to return to God, direct your attentions to Him, and serve Him with all your heart. Only Him, no counterfeits involved. I'm the Lord your God. I'll have no other gods in my midst before me. You worship me and me alone, or you don't worship me properly. And so that's what Samuel is offering this great leader. So we move forward. National deliverance we see in verse 5. It says in verse 4, Israel did it. They removed the Baals. They removed the Ashtaroth, and they served Yahweh alone. And then Samuel said he calls this great gathering of the Jews. Remember what the focus is: getting Philistine oppression off. He said, gather all Israel to Mizpah. The word Mizpah means watchtower. It's an elevated place in Israel, watchtower on a hill, Mizpah. Samuel says, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to Yahweh for you. What a leader of men. He didn't say, come to me and I'll figure out what we're going to do. He says, come to me and I'll petition Yahweh so that He can lead us. Samuel is clearly here the leader of Israel. He is judging Israel. He's the one Israel turns to when they need guidance, when they need deliverance, when they need protection. They're turning to Samuel. Interesting, they're not turning to the high priest anymore. At one time they turned to the high priest, but not now. Remember who the high priest was just recently? It was Eli. Remember how horrible his two sons were, Hophni and Phinehas? Again, having sexual relations with the ladies at the doors of the temple, remember, at the tabernacle. Remember that? You wonder, where do they get that twisted idea that that could possibly be a form of worship? Read what is here on the board here. It was all pagan. They adopted the pagan ways of worship. And so the high priest Eli had fallen from grace 20 years earlier when he allowed his two sons to take the Ark of the Covenant into battle against the Philistines. They caused this problem. So the high priest's name was tarnished in these days. They looked to Samuel for leadership. They looked to Samuel. Verse 6 says, they gathered to Mizpah. I wonder if they were gathering for war. You could read 100 different people on this. And 50 would say they gathered merely for worship, to return to the Lord, to have this type of revival, if you will. And the others will say, yes, they gathered for revival, but the focus here is on being delivered from the Philistines, and that takes war. And so the gathering would be a gathering of the armies also of Israel. And I'm in that camp, clearly, that they are gathering not only for this return for Samuel to pray to the Lord for guidance, but they are gathering for war also. It says in verse 6, they gathered to Mizpah. And this is what the people did in worship of the Lord. In confession, it says they drew water. So they got water into buckets or pails. They drew water. And instead of drinking it, they poured it out before the Lord. And they also fasted on that day. And they said, we have sinned against Yahweh. Remember, you have to turn away from the false gods, return to the one true God. And part of that return isn't just, okay, God, we're back, love us again. Oh no, confession is in between those two. And Israel understood it. They are confessing to the Lord. It says, we have sinned against Yahweh. And Samuel judged the sons of Israel at Mizpah. There are several times in the scripture where it says, my heart is poured out. Even Jesus Christ on the cross said, in Psalm 22 at least, it says that his heart was poured out before the Lord. A symbolic representation. Let's talk about this just for a minute. This pouring out. We know what fasting is. They would take off their normal clothes and they would put on clothes like sackcloth, like burlap, we would call it. They would put ashes, like fire ashes all over their bodies. This was a humbling, a humiliated look for them. They would go to the Lord with sackcloth and ashes. It was a symbolic representation that fasting, obviously, they wouldn't eat food. Well, this has to do not with food, but with water. And it's also a symbolic representation, just like fasting. It's a representation of the temporal and spiritual distress they were in. This pouring out of water, since their own sin is what led to their situation. They say, we've sinned against you, Father. The distress and turmoil that we're in is our own fault. Then this pouring out of water was also part of their confession. The confession of the misery that they were in. It's an act of deepest humiliation, just like putting on sackcloth and ashes before Yahweh. That's what they're doing. It says that Samuel judged Israel here. I want to show you very quickly what it means to judge Israel. Samuel brings them together. He leads them. He directs them toward Yahweh. Says our worship is wrong. You have to worship God only. He directs them in that way. Then he gathers them together at Mizpah like a leader would and says, I will pray for you there. What's he praying for? What was a judge's role? We looked at this months ago when we started the book of Judges, but what were the judges expected to do, and is Samuel doing it for Israel? I'm asking you these questions for this reason. What did I tell you is about to happen in 1 Samuel chapter 8? What is Israel about to do? They're about to reject Yahweh as their king, reject Samuel as their judge, and demand of Samuel a king to lead them in battle. That's what's about to happen. So I'm asking these questions about Samuel to say, did the Jews have any reason to do that? They had a reason to turn their faith away from the high priesthood because of who Eli was and who his sons were. They were driven away from that. But did Samuel drive them away to think these judges are horrible? Or was Samuel doing an excellent job before the Lord, making Israel have no excuse to want to reject him? That's the answer. He was a great judge. So what did the judges do? They would interpret God's rulership of Israel at the current time. What does God want us to do, Israel, as a nation right now? It was the judge's job to determine that. Does he want us to go to war against our oppressors? What is it that is God's will in this situation? How does God intend to deliver Israel? What are we to do? Remember Gideon. And all the drinking of the water. If the men who drink the water in a certain way, you'll count those, but the men who drink it with their tongues like a dog, you'll let those go home, or whichever it was, I forget. God was showing through the judge how he would deliver Israel with 300 men, not 10,000. And the judge had to ascertain all these things, had to know these things. Samuel is praying to God for guidance, just like the judge was supposed to do. The judge was supposed to lead Israel to recognize God's kingship. God is king. Samuel is merely the judge. Samuel never tried to usurp God's authority. Samuel never tried to make more of himself than he was. He was the judge of Israel, and he knew it. He stayed in his lane, if you will. The judge was to lead Israel to submit to God's rulership completely. That's exactly what Samuel is doing here. Gather Israel, and I will pray to Yahweh and see what we are to do. It's exactly what he's doing. He's leading Israel to submit to Yahweh's rulership, not Samuel's leadership. He's an understudy for God. That's all he wants to be, an under-shepherd. God is the shepherd. God is the king. Samuel's not trying to take that position from God. A couple of thoughts before we get out of this. God never set up a judge to be king. They were merely to be judges for a short period of time. But God was always the king. Yahweh was the king during this period of Israel's history. Nothing was to change there. Samuel was a great, great judge of Israel. One of the best they ever had. And it's in the time of Samuel that Israel would say, we need someone else. We don't want God to be king over us. We don't want you to rule as judge. What I'm trying to point out as we go into the rest of this story is if they had zero reason to reject a judge, it was this judge Samuel. He did nothing wrong. Why would you cast off a man who was the greatest leader of his time? And that's exactly what Israel will do. Verse 7, let's keep going. Now when the Philistines heard, so Samuel is at Mizpah. He's judging the people, trying to ascertain the will of God. How is God going to cast off the Philistines? We've done our part. We've returned. We've directed. We're serving Yahweh alone. What does God have in store for Israel? Samuel is speaking to God, trying to figure these things out. The Philistines realize that all of Israel is in one place. Now's the time to attack them. This will be easy. So in verse 7 it says, now when the Philistines heard that the sons of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. This is war talk. And when the sons of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. How many years have gone by since the Philistines and the Ark of the Covenant and all of that mess? We read it in the very first couple of verses of this chapter. 20 years had gone by. Remember, the ark was in Philistia for 7 months, so 20 years and 7 months or so have gone by since the last great battle with the Philistines. That's enough time for a new generation to raise up. 20 years. That's enough time for a new group of soldiers to come up that maybe didn't realize the past, maybe didn't understand it as well as the generation that was there. So these Philistines mount up in battle array against Israel, and the Jews are afraid. The last time we mounted up in battle array against the Philistines, we lost 34,000 Jewish boys. The Ark of the Covenant was taken, and it took 7 months for Yahweh to bring the Ark back into our land. The Philistines are back. They want to fight. They're all here, and it made Israel tremble. We didn't beat them before. We won't beat them now. We are not militarily strong enough to defeat this people. And that's why they were afraid. So, of course, the Jews all together in one place. The Philistines think, what better place to attack? What better time to attack? These fools have gathered, making it easy for us. My question also is, though, what about the Philistines from 20 years ago? Remember what happened to the Philistines when the ark was in the land of Philistia. Remember, they brought it to Dagon. They set it up in his temple as a trophy to Dagon. And one day Dagon falls down. They have to prop their god back up. The next day he falls down. His head is off. His authority's been taken by Yahweh and the covenant and the Ark of the Covenant. His hands are broken off. His power has been taken by Yahweh and His Ark. What about that memory? Why don't these Philistines realize, why don't they remember, you know what, 20 years ago, 20 years isn't a long time. 20 years ago, we had the ark of this God in our land. He destroyed the temple of our great God Dagon. He caused all these hemorrhoids, all these horrible afflictions on us, and He caused madness also until we drove Him out of our land, and it was us that drove Him. We asked Him to leave. We sent Him out on milk cows. We sent His ark out. What happened to that understanding? Why aren't these Philistines afraid of Yahweh? Isn't that an interesting thought? How quickly we forget things. How quickly humans forget history. And forget that this Yahweh is greater than our God Dagon. He proved it. We saw it. And now these men's children have gathered, and certainly some of those same men also are still alive. But only 20 years have gone by, and already they've totally lost their fear of Yahweh. They should be still afraid of this God. But they've totally lost their fear of Yahweh. They have no understanding of what He's capable of and the destruction of their God in their God's own temple. Didn't they listen to their parents? Did their parents not teach them this? Or did they just simply refuse to learn from history? Verse 8, only 20 years have gone by, and these people who were terrified of Yahweh are now fighting the people of Yahweh. Crazy. The sons of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to pray, or do not cease to cry to the Lord our God for us, for Yahweh our God, Yahweh the God of Israel. Remember, they've put off the Baals, the Ashtaroth, they've put off all of that. They know that God alone can protect them. They are crying out to Samuel to continue crying out to Yahweh, please deliver us from the mighty hand of the Philistine army. Do not cease to cry to Yahweh our God for us, that He may save us from the hand of the Philistines. Now, I told you 20 years earlier, the Philistines were afraid of Yahweh, but also when you think of how the Jews responded to Yahweh 20 years earlier, when they were faced with war with the Philistines, remember what they did? Instead of crying out to Yahweh to save them, they simply took the Ark of the Covenant into battle like a lucky charm, thinking, oh, as long as we have this semblance of God, He will protect us. So we see the Philistines lose their fear of Yahweh. We see the Jews regain their fear of Yahweh. You see what's going on here? Where one has rejected Yahweh as a God mightier than their false god Dagon, the other has come back to realize our God is the most powerful God, the only God there is. And so Israel now is bowing their knees to Yahweh properly. 20 years earlier, the Jews thought just this image of God could help them, and now they've come to realize that Yahweh only is able to protect them, at least for the moment. In verse 9, Samuel took a suckling lamb, representative of this new nation, Israel, new in the spiritual sense. They've cast off the Baals. They're worshiping Yahweh again. It's been a long time since they've been in the worship of Yahweh. And so he chooses a young lamb, a suckling lamb, to represent this young, revived Israel. Samuel took a suckling lamb and he offered it for a whole burnt offering to Yahweh. So he's worshiping Yahweh by offering animals, animal sacrifices, sacrificial blood sacrifices. He offers a burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to Yahweh for Israel. And Yahweh answered him. because it was the right time and because Samuel had done it in the right way. You've led Israel valiantly, spiritually, by having them cast off all their false god worship. You've led Israel to return to me only in worship. You're crying out to me. You're showing the people by your leadership that prayer to Yahweh is job one in leadership. And you're worshiping me through animal sacrifice, through substitutionary sacrificial sacrifice. And so Yahweh, pleased with what Samuel and the people of Israel brought, Yahweh answered him. Now, another aside, some think that the tabernacle, it says here that Samuel took a lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering. Somebody tell me, where were all of the offerings supposed to take place in Israel? All of them. At the tabernacle. But Samuel is doing this at Mitzpah. So some believe because of that, because Samuel wouldn't have done this wrong, some think that the tabernacle may have been erected at Mitzpah during this time, after Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines 21 years earlier. The tabernacle is not in Shiloh. The tabernacle made, now I'm talking about the tent structure, it was movable. God made it to be moved. Moved it many times. And some think after Shiloh, 20 years earlier, the Battle of Aphek, when it was destroyed by the Philistines, some think, and it may be and it may not be, it may be that they re-erected it, this tabernacle at Mitzpah, and it's here that Samuel is offering the offering. But we do know that the ark was still at Kiryat Yerim, and it will stay there for another 80 years. So even if the tabernacle is at Mitzpah, they didn't move the ark from the house of Abinadab. They didn't move it here to Mitzpah. So either way, Samuel is the one that's offering this burnt offering. Now let me ask you another question. Who was it in Israel? What tribe was supposed to be able to offer offerings to God? No one else but this tribe. To be able to take an animal, slaughter it, and burn it as a whole burnt offering to God. What tribe did God call out to do that work? It was Levi. Is Samuel a Levite? Anybody remember? If Samuel isn't a Levite, Samuel is doing something wrong here. He is not a priest. He's not one in the age of Israel that's supposed to offer offerings to Yahweh. Samuel is a priest. I'll save you the verses, but Samuel is a priest. He's from Levi's son Kohath. He is in the line of Levi's son Kohath. Samuel is a priest. I showed you that when we first started 1 Samuel a few weeks ago. He's descended from Levi's son. He is a priest. Samuel is a prophet and a priest and a judge. As close to the man Jesus as you could get, Jesus who will one day not only continue reigning as prophet and priest, but will take on the role of king. Samuel was a prophet, a priest, not a king, but a judge. A prophet, a priest, and a judge. Nobody got as close to holding all three roles in Israel. No other man ever got as close to holding all three roles in Israel, prophet, priest, and king, as Samuel did. Prophet, priest, and judge. Quite the man, Shemuel. So look what it says. It says that Samuel offered a burnt offering. The Lord was pleased with all of these things. The Lord answered him. In verse 10 it says, now Samuel, look at what happened at the same time. Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, this suckling lamb. And at the same time the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. They must have been in a compromised position to where the lords of the Philistines looked over and saw this fire going up and thought, oh, they're doing their rituals right now. What a great time to attack. And so they did. They attacked during the worship. And Yahweh had something to say about that. It says, but Yahweh thundered with a great thunder on that day against the Philistines. You can interrupt my people at certain times, but you cannot interrupt my people at other times. I just think of this picture. Remember when Israel is leaving Egypt, the cloud, the pillar of cloud, the angel of the Lord in the pillar of cloud would lead them, led them all the way to the Sea of Reeds. The Bible calls it the Red Sea. The Jews turn around and see the Egyptian army coming towards them. They're panicked, they're fearful. Only God could save them. And what does the pillar of cloud do? What does the angel of the Lord do? Instead of being in front between the Israelites and the sea, I can see the angel of the Lord. The scripture says it. He went around to the back and said, "You will not pass here. I'll protect my children." And the angel of the Lord in the pillar of cloud moved to the back and protected Israel on that day. On this day, the same God thundered with a great thunder, and He protected His people Israel. They're worshiping me. Go away. The Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day against the Philistines and confused them so that they were routed before Israel. Now, I tell you, this is a worship service that turned into a military battle. Because look what it says in verse 11. You say, no, in verse 10 it looks like God did everything. God thundered and the Philistine army was destroyed. But look at verse 11. The men of Israel went out of Mizpah. This gathered army went out to chase the Philistines. They went out of the men of Israel went out of Mizpah. They pursued the Philistines and struck them down. That's a sword word. They struck them down as far as below Bet-Kar. So God caused this thundering. God thundered. The Philistine army was confused by it. They're running around, don't know what to do. Israel attacks in battle and wins the battle that God had started. Yahweh caused the great thunder on that day. And the great God of thunder, what's his name? Baal. All of a sudden, who's the greater God? Remember, Philistines, I destroyed your god Dagon in his own temple. 20 years have gone by. You clearly didn't get the message then. I'll destroy your god Baal by causing thunder, which he's supposed to be in control of. I'll cause thunder to allow the Israelites to defeat you in battle. Where once Israel was totally defeated by the Philistines, 34,000 Jews died. 20 years earlier, now Yahweh causes a complete reversal, a turn of the tides, and Yahweh causes a complete defeat of the Philistine army by a lesser army, the army of Israel. The crazy thing about this is this power and this protection available from Yahweh was always available to Israel. It was always available to Israel. But they would cast it off, and they would walk away from the power and protection of Yahweh. They would start worshiping these false gods, and we have this cycle of the judges until we get to the next chapter when Israel will say, you know what, Lord, we're done. We're done. We've had a good run. We're done. We want a human king. We want a human king to lead us into battle. What's wrong with the way Yahweh leads them in this battle? What's wrong with the outcome of this battle? Why do you want a human king to lead you in battle? What did God do wrong on this day? It says the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day against the Philistines. The Lord confused them, and the Lord allowed them to be routed before Israel so that Israel could go out and strike them down. What's wrong with that? Why would Israel only a very short time later say, Samuel, we're done with this? I mean, short time meaning maybe 30 years, but even still, what happened? Short memories. We all have too short a memory. And Samuel will do something here to try to help with the shortness of human memory. Look what it says in verse 12. Samuel took a stone. Samuel, a brilliant man, a wonderful man of God, understands the shortness of the memories of a man. So he'd set up a memorial. You won't remember this on your own, but hopefully when you see these rocks, you'll remember what God did here. Instead of turning from Him, you'll remember the greatness of what He did here. Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer. And he said, thus far the Lord has helped us. The Hebrew word Eben, E-B-E-N, Eben is the word for stone or rock. Ezer is the word for helper. God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and He took a rib from Adam, and out of that rib He formed a helper, Ezer. The same word used for Eve, the helpmate of Adam. It's the same exact word used for God the Holy Spirit. Jesus says, it's to your advantage that I go away. If I go away, I'll ask the Father, and He will send another helper. Parakletos is the Greek word, but the Hebrew word is Ezer. The wife is called the Ezer. God the Holy Spirit is called the Ezer. And here Samuel sets up a stone and calls it the stone of help. This stone should remind you, Israel, of how God brought us to this spot and defeated the Philistines before us. Because we were worshiping properly, we had put away the false gods. Remember, everything that God did to get you to this point, here is a stone of remembrance to help with these short memories. We have a song in the hymnal, I don't know what number it is, but the song, Come Thou Fount. Here I raise mine what? Here I raise mine Ebenezer. That's exactly where this word has come from. That's where that writer knew the Bible from 1 Samuel chapter 7. He takes that phrase. What does he mean by that when we sing the song? It says, here I raise mine Ebenezer, this remembrance of God's movement in my life. I recognize God in my life. He has done something on this day, and I will raise a memorial so that when I move down in life and trials and troubles hit me, I can look back to this memorial and say the same God that saw me through that is the God that will see me through this. My circumstances may have changed, but what hasn't changed? God hasn't changed. And that's exactly what Samuel was trying to do here for Israel, a great leader of men. The song says, here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come. I've come this far in my life because of what you have done for me, God. And then he says this in the song, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. You've done so much for me already. There's no question that you'll take me to eternal glory also. That's what the song means. That's what the verse says. Here I raise mine Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. This memory that we set up will give me courage to press forward, knowing that God will help me again and again and again. Israel needed that remembrance. Samuel gave it to him in the stone, the Ebenezer, the stone of God's help. Unfortunately, if you look in our hymnal, it says Ebenezer, but unfortunately, if you look in other hymnals, and I went around recently and looked at like 8 hymnals, and about half of them changed the word Ebenezer out of it. They simply changed the phrase because it's easier just to change the phrase than it is to go to 1 Samuel chapter 7 and teach the Bible. Right? We'll just change that old-fashioned word. This old-fashioned word is a fantastic word. Should never be changed. Here I raise mine Ebenezer the same way that Samuel raised it to show that Yahweh has done this for Israel. We turn to Yahweh. He has defeated the Philistines before us. 20 years ago we lost 34,000 men. Today they're the ones that lost all the men. And this is Yahweh's doing. And we need to remember how Yahweh works. When we are properly worshiping Him, when our relationship is right with God, we have to remember what He did, confident that He'll continue to do it. And so He set up this stone of remembrance. Verse 13, It says, so the Philistines were subdued. They sure were. And they did not come anymore, at least successfully. They tried, but they weren't successful. They did not come anymore successfully within the border of Israel. And the hand of Yahweh was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. Talk about blessing by association. As Samuel as your judge, as long as Samuel as is your judge, I will protect your people. Blessing by association. As long as Samuel was judge, God's hand protected Israel. You see that over and over and over in the pages of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Good kings gained the protection of God. Bad, ungodly kings, Israel was being destroyed. Verse 14. So one statement before we move on. Proper, godly, national leadership. Tomorrow's President's Day. Proper, godly, national leadership leads to peace in a land. That's what they got under Samuel. Proper, godly, national leadership. All the days this proper, godly man led Israel, God's hand was against their enemies. It's exactly what He promised them in Deuteronomy chapter 28. When you properly worship Me, your enemies will turn away from you. It's one of the blessings of the Mosaic Law. We're seeing it played out here in the obedient life of Samuel and the obedient life of the Jews, at least in the time period in which Samuel was virile. What happened with Samuel is what happens to all of us. You know what it is? He got too stinking old. That's what happened to him. He started losing his power, his authority, his influence over the people. And as he got older, as the 30 years went by, Samuel started losing his effect. He turned to his sons, Joel and Abihud. I always forget that boy's name. But he turns Abijah, Abiyah. Yahweh is my father. Wow. And his two sons, Yoel and Abiyah, were bad sons. Samuel got too old. The Lord hadn't raised up another judge. Israel lost confidence in Samuel, and they demanded a human king. That's exactly what will happen. What happens? Verse 14 says, the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel. That's exactly what he says. Part of the promise is your cities. You'll have peace in your cities. And all the rest, Deuteronomy 28. It's all here. The cities that the Philistines had taken were restored to Israel from Ekron even to Gath. Remember, these are two of the cities in the last 20 years where the Ark of the Covenant had passed through. They're back in Jewish hands. Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines, so there was peace between Israel and the Amorites, the ancient name of all the hill country people, the Canaanites. Peace. Strong, godly king. Godly nation. Peace. And it says in verse 15, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. Remember, Yahweh is the king of Israel. Samuel is merely his judge. Samuel never tried to usurp any more authority than he had. He knew exactly what God had called him to do, and he did it wonderfully. The system of Yahweh as the king and a man as a judge is working perfectly, flawlessly. Except for Samuel getting old, Israel should have never turned and rejected godly leadership in Samuel. They chose ungodly leadership in Saul. They rejected godly leadership in Samuel and would choose for themselves. They wanted a king. God gave them one they deserved. They rejected Samuel and got Saul. Horrible, horrible transfer of power. Verse 16, concerning the last days of Samuel, it says, he used to go annually on, not the last days, but his days as judge. He used to go annually on circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mitzpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. He was a circuit rider. He would ride around Israel, making sure, just like Paul did. Paul was a circuit rider, going from all these churches, making sure everything was right. Samuel did it in these days. He was judging Israel all these days on this circuit. He was responsive to the needs of his people, the Jews. And the last verse says this, then his return was to Ramah. We hear Samuel was born in Ramah. He would die in Ramah. His life headquarters were in Ramah. It says his return was to Ramah, for his house was there. And there he judged Israel, and he built there an altar to the Lord. This man, Shemuel, he walked with Yahweh. His relationship with Yahweh was intimate. He led Israel with a keen eye. He was aware of their needs. He went on circuit. He just didn't stay where he was. He went to see the people and fill the needs of the people. Remember, the judges were all called out to a very certain specific geographic location. That's why he stayed here in the south in the hill country of Judea. He wasn't called to judge anywhere else. But he judged Israel in the places where he was called to do it all the days of his life. And the most important thing that this man Samuel did for Israel, he focused the Israelites' eyes on Yahweh. Turn from your false gods. Turn from your false gods. Focus on Yahweh only and serve Him only. That's what this man did. Yet they would reject him. In the next chapter, as we'll see, they will reject aging Samuel for King Saul. Let's close in prayer. Father,